Hello and welcome to this YouTube live stream by DW Business with me, Rob Watts, and my colleague and DW's China expert, Clifford Coonan. Now, an energy crunch, a resurgence of COVID-19 and a major property developer on the brink of disaster are all threatening to end the Chinese economic success story. So, over the next hour, we'll be putting your questions to Clifford here about China's looming crisis. Be sure to leave your thoughts and questions in the chat window. Now, let's begin with the story that has shaken markets around the world in recent weeks, that of China Evergrande. The country's largest property developer is sitting on debts of $300 billion and could default on those debts within days. Let's remind ourselves of how we got here.
Fears for the future of Evergrande are swirling through global financial markets, cranking up anxiety on stock exchanges from Hong Kong to Frankfurt and raising the possibility of contagion. Evergrande founder Xu Jiayin's colossal borrowings have left the firm owing more than $300 billion, and it's struggling to pay that back. The latest desperate attempt to raise cash was a $2.5 billion deal to sell its property services unit to smaller rival Hobson. The deal was doomed.
Actually, Hobson and Evergrande have unable to agree to the deal terms, so the deal is suspended right now. Therefore, the Evergrande stock start trading today, and the investor have concern about Evergrande over 300 billion bill. And I think the lesson we learned from this deal is that turning a blind eye to the crisis is making crisis worse.
After the sale fell through, Evergrande's share was back in play. It soon started to slump, tumbling 12%. The failure of the deal brought Evergrande one painful step closer to defaulting. With real estate accounting for nearly 30% of Chinese GDP, Evergrande's collapse would send shockwaves through the world's second biggest economy.
Well, the voice you heard there saying that Evergrande was getting one step closer to defaulting was Clifford Coonan, our China expert. Clifford, another deadline tomorrow, another potential default for China Evergrande. Is it going to happen this time?
Well, I think since we last spoke, we've been calling default. Everyone has. It's been one step after another, but things are not getting better.
It looked really hairy this time last week, didn't it?
It did. I think this time last week we thought it was going to happen over the weekend, but they managed to find $83.5 million behind the couch somewhere. We don't really know where the money came from, but then again, 83.5 isn't that much. But anyway, they found it and they managed to push away the inevitable by another week at least.
We honestly have no idea where that money's come from.
Not really. I think they said they had no cash flow, and they had problems with their cash flow, which means that I don't know where it came from. Basically, you would expect something like that to come from cash flow, but it didn't. So I think either one of the state banks stepped in, or through various cross holdings, they found the money somewhere. But it's whack-a-mole. I mean, these are very small sums compared to the $300-odd billion that we're talking about.
It's extraordinary to think that there could have been some sort of, as you suggested there, almost a government bailout and no one know about it. That would be unheard of in developed nations around the world, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the government has said it won't bail them out, and I think broadly this is probably part of an effort to kind of reel the real estate sector in, but at the same time it's very destabilizing, and it's very unsettling. We got hundreds of thousands of people who have paid money for housing and they're not getting it. They did say during the week that they were restarting work at 10 sites. Again, I don't know how they're going to pay their suppliers, how they're going to pay, all how they're going to pay all their bills. It's very difficult to see. But there's a lot of things almost with a sort of a view towards, there's a major Communist Party Congress coming up in early November,
right.
Which is extremely important. Actually begins on pretty much the same day as one of the next deadlines for default. And President Xi Jinping is not going to want a lot of instability around in the run-up to that. But then again, there's no way of proving if the money came from a state bank. So it's kind of an interesting, conundrum. But basically, yeah, I think.
Actually, we had asked people to submit questions early on before the actual stream on YouTube, and we did have one from Bhavik Singh, who was asking, will the Chinese government back it, or will it let it free fall? Is there any way that it's in the Chinese government's interest to allow Evergrande to default?
This is a very tough question. I mean, the thing is, they don't want. I think overall there is a policy. There's these 3 red lines that real estate firms are not allowed to cross, which ultimately aimed at reining in debt, which ultimately led to Evergrande's current plight. So the government doesn't want them. They don't want property companies borrowing so massively as they have been. On the other hand, it's incredibly destabilizing. It's, you know, we have these homeowners. You've got all the problems with the supply chain. Evergrande's debt is 2% of GDP. When you think about it, that's an enormous amount of money.
And compared to some countries, I thought.
Absolutely, yeah. And so it's very, very serious. And so they don't want that kind of destabilizing effect at all. And I think. So they're kind of caught in a bind because they know that for economic growth to continue, they're going to have to do something about the real estate sector. At the same time, they can't, if they start going in with a bailout, it's going to be, I mean, it's such a massive problem. So very difficult situation for them right now.
We'll get into what they're trying to do to rein in the real estate sector later, because some of it's quite radical, let's say. But we should also remind ourselves of what's at stake should Evergrande collapse. I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but you know there are ordinary Chinese people who are set to really lose out if that happens, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they've paid money down, paid their deposits on these houses, or on this housing, and it's really just a question of you know, how are they going to have that housing secured? I mean, so much growth, about 30% of the economy is based on housing, and a lot of that is these sort of middle class, the new middle class that everyone has been talking about for so long as being the engine of China's remarkable growth in the last 3 decades. So you sort of wonder, you know, how are these people going to be dealt with? Are they going to get their houses? And how is the government going to do that? Because debt is, this addiction to debt that we've seen is quite, you know, toxic. And if you can't cover debt with more debt, because then you go into Ponzi scheme territory, which is where actually a lot of the real estate companies are. But it's a pretty grim situation.
One of the big questions is what impact that will have beyond China, an Evergrande default. I mean, we know that there is concern about that among investors all around the world because we've seen it on the markets in the past couple of months. But you know, what are the dangers to companies outside and economies outside of China?
Yeah, well, I think this is a domestic problem initially. I mean, certainly, you know, the main thing is it's a domestic problem, but you know, it's this world's second biggest economy. So if economic growth starts slowing in China, the contagion is not going to be specifically related to real estate, although they are building projects overseas, but a lot of those seem to be continuing. But the main thing is going to be what the impact of slower economic growth in China and what that will have, what sort of contagion that will have around the rest of the world. You know, a lot of car makers here in Germany are making a lot of money there at the moment. If people start buying fewer cars, that's going to impact here in Germany. The same in you know, even directly in the real estate industry, you know, with the iron ore and building materials, you know, all of these things that you know, the Australian economy, say, really relies on. If those sort of supply chain, if that dries up, that's going to have serious impact on the Australian economy, for example. So the sort of the contagion is really about how overall Chinese economic growth, if it does start to significantly slow, it's already slowing, but if it really starts to slow and even starts to contract, well, then that's going to have an impact around the rest of the world.
In the more immediate future, the contagion that you're talking about is likely to spread to other sections of the Chinese property sector. Are we going to see more Evergrandes?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I mean, it's all this word to talk about contagion in a time of pandemic is really, you know, makes a very grim scenario overall. We have had other major property companies experiencing difficulties. Some of the, but many of them seem to have been better placed. Evergrande also has other areas that it's involved in, like electric cars and things like that. It's talking a lot about its electric car business lately.
Yeah, it's said that that's actually maybe where it's going to have to shift focus because of the problems with real estate, right?
But I don't know how the electric car, it's very hard to imagine how the electric car business, I mean, there's a lot of electric cars being sold in China right now, but how can that cover a $300 billion debt? You know, so sounds a little bit like a certain sort of pipe dream. But yeah, we have seen other companies not defaulting, but also pushing ahead payment deadlines. And it's just a question, I guess, of how quick that happens and how quick the contagion spreads among the other companies. But they do seem to be in slightly better shape than Evergrande. Evergrande seems to be by far the worst affected.
And disaster for the real estate industry in China. It's a disaster all round for China and Chinese people, right? Because they're heavily dependent on it. I mean, how dependent are they?
Well, I think the real estate sector has really been the driver of growth for so long now. It's 30% of the economy, and it's so it's a real dependence. And we've also become sort of used to to real estate sector growing by significant amount every year. We've had 1 or 2 years where it's slowed or cooled a little bit. They've introduced cooling measures. The government has constantly had to implement cooling measures to stop it from overheating. But you know, where you have to pay a bigger deposit to buy an apartment, for example, or you're only allowed to buy 1 apartment for your family. You're not allowed to buy 10, which is what a lot of people have done.
Right.
And so they've introduced these things, but the problem, of course, is that it hasn't really worked. I mean, the thing just keeps growing, and if we suddenly don't have this expansion in the real estate sector, what that means for the Chinese economy, they can switch into. I mean, I know Xi Jinping wants to switch into things like high tech and other areas, but again, it's going to be a very, very difficult move to sort of wrestle their way out of the real estate addiction.
Well, let's just go back to Evergrande, and we're going to get a little bit more analysis because it's something we've talked about an awful lot on DW Business over the past few weeks, the past couple of months. So let's hear some more analysis on the situation at China Evergrande. Here's the China analyst and author Fraser Howey speaking to my colleague Monica Jones.
I was wondering if Beijing is happy to basically just stand by and watch this drama unfold, having such a company basically defaulting on such a huge amount of debt, aggravating international investors in this current climate who might just as well turn their back on China and say it's no longer worth it.
Well, I think that's the key point here. It's not so much that there's a direct contagion in the sense that there's $300 billion owing to foreign markets or something. That simply is not the case here. There simply isn't this is not Lehman Brothers, as it were, Chinese style. This is a very domestic sort of concern. But when you've got one of the biggest property developers in China basically collapsing, when you've got a confidence in a 30% of the economy evaporating, that clearly must send worrying sort of signs to any foreign investor, and simply saying is that there is no Chinese miracle here, that the much sort of vaunted long-term Chinese planning just is a myth.
Fraser Howey, the China analyst and author, speaking to my colleague Monica Jones there. Clifford, there's a clear tactic in Beijing that it's applying across multiple sectors at the moment, which is turning the screw on its tycoons. Putting its pressure on China's most wealthy people. We're seeing that in the property sector, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, Xu Jiayin has fallen down the rankings this week. The chairman of Evergrande, yes. He's fallen way down the rankings in this week's rich list.
And from 5th to 70th.
Yeah. So that was quite a drop. And I think also, overall, you're sort of seeing pressure on these captains of industry, because partially political, I think, because they represent a power base. We saw the Alibaba founder, Jack Ma, recently. He's been in trouble, and he's just reappeared after about a year, I think, out of public view in Spain. That was interesting, seeing him on his yacht, and a lot of people were wondering whether the door locked from the inside or the outside, and whether he was going back. But it seems that he's reached some accommodation with the government. But again, he was China's richest man last year, and this year he's been overtaken by the head of Nongfu Spring Water. So there's been movement there, but the rich list thing in China is a big, you know, there's a long history of being problematic, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, the water magnate that now sits at the top of that tree have they got to watch their back now?
They must be feeling nervous. I mean, this has been going on for a few years now. We had it back in the 2000s as well, where we had Xu Ming, who was close to Bo Xilai, who was one of the pretenders to Xi Jinping's throne, who was subsequently deposed on corruption charges. Using the testimony of Xu Ming, and he was formerly on the rich list. In China, it's called the kill pig list because it's you know, you just don't want to put your head above the parapet, you know, because suddenly you're quite exposed if you get on the rich list. You know, you lose government subsidies if you get on the rich list, for example, for your company, because clearly you're doing very well. So it's kind of a mixed. It's not like in the West where I think people, you know, getting on the rich list, I imagine, is a source of pride to a lot of the wealthy in the West. But in China, it's a very ambiguous reaction to this, you know, to what's going on. And I think. Yeah, Jack Ma is a great example. We've also had very early on one of the early tycoons from Gome, which is a big retail electronics company. He ended up in jail. So quite a few have ended up in jail and deposed or usually hit with corruption charges, a lot of corruption charges, particularly when the power changes in China between whether the government, whichever leader is in power, they have their personal favourites. But I think what's different with the current clampdown on the tycoons, first of all, like we see with Xu from Evergrande, that it's part of the overall crackdown on the real estate sector. But then Jack Ma is part of a crackdown on the tech sector. So
sure.
They're all, it's basically not a very good time to be a tycoon in China.
Yeah, I would just say, if you've got a question or a comment for us, do leave it in the comment section. I will be putting them to our China expert here, Clifford Coonan. We're talking about the looming crisis in China, not just the situation at Evergrande, but also the energy crunch that's being experienced there, that's coinciding with a resurgence in COVID-19 and causing all sorts of problems for the government in Beijing. We've had one comment from Adam G saying, could we stop calling Xi a president? He's a dictator. What you've just been talking about is a clear apathy among the government in Beijing towards powerful men outside of the government, rich men.
Yeah.
Why is there that?
Well, it's basically the antipathy is coming from, I mean, the point about Xi Jinping being a president, or I mean, I think what we normally try to use as leader as the neutral phrase, because indeed, president is something that tends to be more associated with a democracy, and China's not a democracy. But his most important title is chairman because he's the head of the Communist Party, and his three titles are leader, chairman, and then head of the military.
Right.
But but that head leadership of the Communist Party, and he has centred so much power on himself that this means that there can be no others around. You know, there can't be any rivals. And frankly, these billionaires are rivals. I mean, you know, Jack Ma is incredibly wealthy. And so he's taken on this antipathy, is focused on these people who he sees as potential threats. Certainly part of the reform and these crackdowns on various sectors is to do with genuine reform. But I think a big part of it is also very political, because anytime any organised opposition to the Communist Party manages to take shape, it gets crushed. And we saw that with the Falun Gong movement. We've seen it with the democracy movement in 1989. There's a long tradition of this. And while maybe it's not as clear-cut in many ways, but you still are seeing this crackdown on the tycoons, which is very much linked to keeping a grip on the country.
Just had another question come in from Dino Nino. I have no idea how to say that. Apologies if you've sent that in. For how long have the Chinese been at the brink of collapse? How do we interpret that question? Has it been too good to be true for too long for the Chinese economy?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And there is a history. You know, the road of sort of China watching is littered with, the reputations of people who said that the economy is going to collapse. The economy is going to collapse. You know, basically, everyone's been calling it for a very long time, but it just doesn't happen. It just keeps expanding. Now,
does this feel any different to those other times?
It does, actually. I don't know I think collapse is probably overdone, but certainly it feels different because in some ways it's unprecedented. You know, we've got so much power concentrated on Xi Jinping. The economy has expanded by so much. We've had there's been just so many different things going on that which are, as I say, unprecedented. There's, that I think it does feel different. But then again,
you don't want to be one of
I know, I don't want to be
one of those ones
Yeah.
who thought they called it and didn't.
Yeah, I mean, we had Gordon Chang, who's a very famous commentator, and China wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China, and I think it was in the early 2000s and didn't happen. And then more recently, we've had a number that Roger Garside, the commentator who we featured on Deutsche Welle, he's written a book called The China Coup, and it forecasts the collapse. And it's a very interesting thesis, because he sort of says that if Chinese companies would stop getting listings in America, that eventually China would start looking inward more and more, and eventually that would put economic pressure on Xi Jinping. So theoretically, a lot of this is very possible. And I think the levels of debt are so immense, you start wondering how much of this growth has been built on debt, and how much is that a reason, So
we wouldn't necessarily know about it if it had, would we?
No. I mean, it's still a black box. We can't see in. We don't know how decisions get made in China. We just see the results, So. Yeah, it does feel a bit different this time, but I'd steer clear of talking about collapse. And as I say, there is a great tradition of saying that China is going to fail, but there's definitely a lot of issues to be dealt with.
But collapse is a word that we can use when we talk about China Evergrande, because it's a genuine prospect coming up, and no region's going to be more affected by that than Southeast Asia. And that's one of the questions that we've had actually from D. Mal. Considering many Chinese real estate companies investing in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, would there be any spillover effects, and in what way and in what magnitude?
Well, I think, it's an interesting question too. I mean, Southeast Asia is so linked in with China, and particularly there's the whole Chinese diaspora in many countries, and China has massively invested in these areas, and like everyone else, they become very dependent, but their proximity means that they're even more reliant. So the spillover would certainly be felt in Southeast Asian nations, which are increasingly relying on the Chinese market, and also who see themselves part of the Belt and Road, or who are getting investment from China. But also countries like Japan and in the region is also, even though there's a lot of rivalry between the two, Japan is also very heavily reliant on China, although it's, as I say, it tends to be a bit more defiant when it comes to dealing with China. But I think it's definitely going to be spillover, and also be interesting to see what happens in South Asia, in India. I mean, India is always, it's interesting the way, again, there's a lot of antipathy between the two countries, but, people are looking at India a lot at the moment to see how India is going to develop and how India is going to grow as a counterbalance to China. So were China to suddenly start slipping, one would wonder, would India step into its place, because India, we've been waiting for India's big upturn for a long time now. I mean, the economy is expanding, but not at the rate I think people were expecting or hoping.
Sure.
And you wonder, is that because China is so strong in the region? So it certainly would be an interesting scenario, wouldn't it?
It would. We had another question from Farhad H. We answered it a little bit, but can this housing crisis start a domino effect across the globe in other countries? We've established, yes. Especially that China is doing construction in many countries. That's something that we haven't really talked about. It's the fact that China is a big builder overseas, particularly in developed nations. Is any of that put in jeopardy by what's happening in the Chinese property market?
Well, this is, if you look at particularly African nations who are, China has been very involved in Africa now in developing there an investment and in importing raw materials, building rail links. They've really they've stepped in a way that Western nations haven't, or certainly they're very good at telling that narrative. And but it's true, they have invested a lot there. If a lot of that is built on debt, for example, if people have borrowed and if suddenly those debts get called in because of an economic slowdown in China, that would have massive effect. I think so much of this is built on the idea of China growing more than it is in debt. So I think as long as the economy keeps expanding, you can hide the debt because you can keep repaying the coupons. But you just sort of think that once that once the debt once it overtakes the rate of growth, it's going to be extremely difficult.
Actually, we have seen the impact of changes in policy in Beijing on developed nations. For example, China's decided, or announced anyway, that it was planning to stop investing in coal overseas. That's at least what was announced a few months ago. Do you think that policy might have changed recently, given the coal shortage that China is now experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's interesting because we have the climate summit coming up now, and obviously China's participation is very important in efforts to combat climate change. Xi Jinping isn't going. Well, accounts, he hasn't left the country now.
This is COP26, right?
COP26, yeah.
Begins next week.
Yeah, that's right. And he hasn't left the country now for 630 days or something like that. Which
keeping count.
Yeah. Well, people are wondering why, because all the other G20 leaders have started moving again post, we're not post-COVID yet, but
no.
As we come out of it, they've all been out and about, but he's been very firmly at home. So they will send representatives to Glasgow, where the summit is taking place. But we've noticed that a lot of them, short term, they just want to use coal. They just want to keep the economy ticking over. And I don't think they're unusual in that. I think a lot of countries have just said, whatever it takes to keep things going as long as there's this energy crunch. So, I think, but what that means for longer term, I mean, China has made various commitments, but ultimately, it's going to be very, very difficult to see those commitments being met because they tend to be they're often linked to political issues. They come with conditions, and that makes it very difficult for countries like the US. I mean, ultimately, I think you're going to see competition with China on energy. You're going to see things like the EU is introducing a carbon tax, which means that Chinese goods will have to pay this carbon. They'll become more expensive, and I think that's the kind of way forward. I mean, in some ways, that's a separate issue. But I think looking at coal use, short term, I think definitely China is going to go back to it. It has already. Longer term, maybe they'll pull out of it, but they're still building a lot of coal-powered stations,
Let's talk much more about the energy crunch in a second. I just want to remind people who may have just tuned in what we're doing here. I'm Rob Watts, and this is Clifford Coonan, DW's China expert, and we are talking about the various fronts on which China is fighting at the moment, including the Evergrande crisis and the possible knock-on effects for its property sector, also the energy crunch, which we're about to talk to. We want your comments and we want your questions, and I will put as many of them as I can to Clifford here. This is a great opportunity to speak to someone who really knows what they're talking about. So do leave your comments and questions in the chat window and they'll get through to us. So, Clifford, the energy crunch. Actually, I want to know, why do we call it a crunch and not just a straight-up shortage or a crisis? Is there enough energy to go around in China?
I think generally China is reliant on, it's self-sufficient in coal, but it's still, I mean, I read the statistic one time, it certainly was self-sufficient in coal, but it still imports quite a lot of coal.
Yeah, I think 90% is
domestic.
It's domestic coal
Right.
production.
Yeah. Energy security is a huge issue for China. I mean, China is not as big a country as it should be in terms of the population. So food security, energy security are real issues for successive governments going back to imperial times. It's always been heavily focused on making food and having energy, but it's been forced to rely on its neighbours for both. So this is another example, a contemporary example of this in many ways. I think the crunch is to do with the fact that there's many different aspects happening at once, because the energy crisis is combining with the pandemic as well. And so, but it's definitely, the shortages at the moment seem pretty extreme in some places, and it's combining then, as I say, with the pandemic because goods can't get into the country, and iron ore coal supplies or other energy supplies can't make it. So
why is that? Why? Let's get down to the root causes of the energy crunch in the first place. It's a hangover from, well, I say a hangover from the pandemic. The pandemic is still ongoing, but ultimately, what's it down to?
Yeah, it's a repercussion, isn't it? Yeah, hangover, as you say. It's
not unique to China either.
No, but what is unique to China, well, first of all, is its size, obviously, but is the zero COVID approach that they have. So whenever they get a few cases, they just shut down everything. And for a while, everyone was admiring this policy, because they basically got rid of COVID. I mean, you're still only talking about a handful of cases there, in such a large country, 30 cases, I think, the other day, and it's not a lot. But at the same time, now the impact on the economy is so severe, because if you can't get your stuff in, that your energy goods in, then you've got a problem. So I think people have turned from being sort of very admiring of how China was dealing with the pandemic to being a little bit more skeptical, and particularly now in the West, that it seems that people or in other countries are getting better sort of living with COVID, and not as well as they should be perhaps, but certainly it seems to be more of a trend in other countries.
I just want to. We'll sort of go backwards a little bit here, just to address some of the questions that we've had sent in. It goes a little bit back towards Evergrande. We've heard from Harley the Salami. Question from a sausage. What's the impact of Evergrande's debt on their lenders? So ultimately, they're going to lose their money.
I think ultimately they will. I mean, a lot of it is Chinese state banks. And so then you're entering a very opaque world. You don't know where the money, the cross holdings that are between banks and different companies, you just don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. For the international banks, I think it's they must be reckoning that they're not going to get their money back unless there's some sort of. I've been thinking about this, trying to imagine how a rescue plan would work. And even then, it's sort of. Are you throwing bad money after bad? Is it something that they're going to deal with after this party congress that we mentioned earlier? Coming up on the 6th of November. I think the lenders will probably, as long as it's just a question of these smaller $83 million payments, yes. Finding the money behind the couch. As long as you can keep doing that, I think we're not going to have this crisis, and the lenders will probably be reasonably secure. But ultimately, I think I can't see where the money's going to come from.
A question we've had multiple times actually is whether or not we can really expect Evergrande to prioritise repaying its foreign investors over its domestic investors. Is that out of the question?
I think that's extremely unlikely. But that would be a gut feeling. Maybe there would be a fear that they will need overseas investment to pull out, and they will prioritise the foreign investors.
Particularly when we don't know where this bailout money is coming from.
Yeah, exactly, or where exactly the larger sums anyway would come from. I think that's an open question. I don't think the foreign firms and foreign banks are going to be prioritised, though.
Question from Paolo Cozzolino. Could the financial turmoil triggered by Evergrande affect specifically European and German real estate, especially after the small to mid earthquake caused by the Adler Ray case?
Right.
So we won't go into the Adler Ray case, but let's talk about Europe and the impact there from what's happening in China.
I think in Europe the impact on the real estate sector will be reasonably minor. But I think, again, if there's a broader slowdown in the economy, that will have an impact on Europe. The most Chinese people who have money to invest, the only really way they have to invest money is to put it into property, because the stock market is very, very closed, very difficult to get into, and there's precious few other investment opportunities, and you can't invest out of the country. So, so a lot of that investment has gone in there. But that means then if the economy slows down, they're not going to be buying a Volkswagen car or
that's the knock-on, right? It's the fact that if Chinese people have less money, then we're exporting less to China. The biggest market for a lot of countries, one of the biggest markets for many others. And it's worth mentioning that the majority of Chinese households own their home. And Chinese people are big property owners, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's really interesting too. I mean, when I was there, when I first went there in 2003, when I moved there in 2003, there was no... The property market was, it was much smaller, obviously, but it was expanding really fast, and but there was no question of a second-hand market. A lot of, say, in the European market, you have a big market in second-hand houses, but no one wanted an old house. They wanted new stuff. They wanted new everything.
Right.
Which was so. It's only even now, and even now, second-hand market is a relatively new idea. A lot of it has to do. It's a little bit. You get that in other Asian countries too, like in Japan. Often, you're buying the space that the property occupies rather than the actual building. Because it's often the buildings get knocked down and rebuilt all the time.
Yeah, every 30 years. I've actually just done a piece. We have a series for DW Business called Business Beyond, and I've just done one on the property market, and it features what's happening in Japan. And you can take that as an interesting example here, because what's happening there is a huge amount of building is going on. The best part of 1 million new properties every single year to service young Japanese who want to move to the city. But it means that there's a huge problem with derelict properties because people don't want to buy old properties. And you're saying that that's a similar problem that China could face in the future.
I think so, definitely. And there is a thing that often there was a couple of projects that would have stopped, for example, because a debt got called in. There was actually across the street from where we lived, there was this building for as long as we lived in Beijing that was there, and it was 3/4 completed, and there was some sort of complicated ownership structure or whatever there, but it never got completed. And then when they finally did sort out the money, and this is right downtown Beijing, they decided to they just knocked it down and rebuilt it, even though they could very easily have just continued it and finished it. But there's just this thing about the investment is always about on new things.
Yeah, you struck a chord with people watching when talking about common prosperity. This a policy, would you call it a policy of Xi Jinping? Can you just explain what it is? And we've had a question from AXBX, I don't know how to pronounce that. How serious is she about the common prosperity thing?
I think common prosperity is just this, is pretty much what it sounds like. It's just the idea that, that wealth is better distributed than it currently is. China has one of the worst wealth gaps in the world at the moment. And as we saw this week, there's a new billionaire every day. So, but still for a lot of people, while their lives have improved, they haven't improved by as much. And there's a growing sense maybe that people feel that they're not going to be able to take part in this social contract, which is the Communist Party says that as long, we will give you a better life. That's what people want. And if they're not getting that, then why should they go with the Communist Party? So, and I think there's a sense now that she is doing this. It's tied in with a whole sort of sweep of nationalism and patriotism that's going on at the moment, and also this moral crusade that is happening, where you've had a ban on effeminate men and clampdown on singers with tattoos and all kinds of.
This brings us back to the tech crackdown as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
The limiting of how much
game time
children can have.
Yeah.
Right.
So common prosperity is part of this broad policy, and this is a very pretty old school communist policy in a way. The idea of better distribution of the wealth, but it kind of also runs counter completely to how China got to where it is today. So she describes it as a phase, which is classic Marxist thinking, next stage in development in history, and lots of talk about history and struggles and all these things that we're familiar with maybe from the era of the Cold War here in Germany, because it's got very similar language in the German Democratic Republic. But so it ties in with that, and it's meant to be an idea that everyone gets a fair share. But if it's to be anything more than just political sloganeering, then massive reform of the economy is needed.
Along those lines, Asia Jia has said, now that they are talking about common prosperity and have started to tweak some taxes, property, for example, do you think there will be big tax changes in China in the future? And will that change China?
Well, the property tax, this is a fascinating one. They've been trying to do this for ages. But there's been a lot of resistance because basically she has just within the last few days introduced a property tax as a pilot project in various sectors. But the problem with this, first of all, is that it's going to be the middle class who are affected by it. And there's also, it's going to reveal a lot of party members who have, it's going to expose a lot of people, who managed to hide their properties and things like this within their own party ranks, So it could I'd be very surprised if they ever actually managed to expand it beyond a certain area or sort of window dressing. I mean, they can't even introduce a property tax in Hong Kong, you know, which is much more open in terms of how its property sector works. So I think, I'd be skeptical. But I think it's about the introduction rather than the implementation.
Another interesting policy that I was reading about was the ban on high-rise buildings that appears to have just been introduced. It's for cities with fewer than 300 inhabitants. They're not allowed to build buildings of more than 150 metres without special dispensation to do so. And whoever gives them that dispensation is accountable for it for the rest of their life. That's about what? Is it about not seeming extravagant? What's the point of that?
I think it's about not appearing extravagant. There is a story. It's not maybe it's unconnected, but in Beijing they built the CCTV, which is the state broadcaster headquarters, by Rem Koolhaas, this avant-garde Dutch architect, and he built this spiral building. It's an amazing looking building, and she hates it by all accounts. Because the rule used to be that you weren't allowed to have any buildings taller, particularly tall buildings in Beijing, and they've since pushed that back and pushed that back and pushed that back. And but that building was also pretty unpopular with Beijingers, and indeed it was unpopular with the CCTV workers who didn't want to move right away across the city But this he's always had a thing about skyscrapers. Now, I don't know if it came directly from him or if it's part of this policy, to sort of exactly not appear extravagant. I mean, we had that amazing story a couple of weeks ago with the Broad Group, which was building a skyscraper in a day. Or a week, sorry, it was a week using prefabricated stuff. Pretty fast, yeah. So I wonder what they're going to do with all their digital printed prefab building skyscrapers now. But yeah, I think that ties in. It would seem to tie in though with the general crackdown, part of that moral crusade, lack of flashiness.
Shows of extravagance being discouraged.
Yeah, I mean, Mao Tai, the liquor that people drink, like to drink, particularly at banquets, you can get some very, very expensive bottles of that. And apparently that's also being clamped down on. People are being told to just stick to the cheaper bottles of liquor rather than the $3,000 or $4,000 ones.
Well, that's helpful when you are facing challenges to your economy. And let's just remind ourselves what we're doing here. This is a DW Business live stream here on YouTube. Thanks a lot for joining us if you are with us. I'm putting your questions to Clifford Coonan, DW's resident China expert, boffin. We've called him many things down the years. We've been talking about China Evergrande. But I just want to go back to talking about the energy crunch that's being experienced in China at the moment. But before we do that, we need to talk about the fact that the Chinese government is urgently working with coal producers to tackle the country's energy crunch. A shortage of the commodity, which is used for most of China's electricity, we've got to remember, has already hit economic growth. As a result, Beijing has been rushing to import more coal from neighbouring nations such as Mongolia. But restrictions brought in to tackle recent COVID-19 outbreaks mean crucial supplies are not getting through.
Truck after truck, as far as the eye can see. This traffic jam at the Chinese border is now 130 kilometers long, with little progress being made. Truckers are increasingly desperate to deliver their coal cargoes after months of brutal COVID-19 delays and no pay. We need money for our families. They're calling us and saying they need wood, fuel, and clothes to wear in winter. Life is hard here. Actually, in China, we're not allowed to get out of our trucks, and it's even forbidden to open our windows. Since we tested negative here, we want to unload the coal in China and get the money and get out as fast as we can. 3,500 drivers have been stuck here for days, stuck in quarantine without pay or enough food. But the transit of coal trucks has come to a standstill due to the strict zero COVID measures taken by China and Mongolia. People in this coal-dependent region fear the worst for their futures. As COVID cases increase here, China will close the border. If borders close, no drivers cross the border. Then our economy will collapse. This area around the city of Secondhand is heavily dependent on coal exports to China. One potential solution, finishing a planned railroad line, but the funds for that project have dried up.
Clifford, it's amazing to see those queues of coal trucks at the border there. This is because we've got this problem of the energy crunch coinciding with COVID-19 and the restrictions, the very strict restrictions that have been brought in. The problems with coal supply at the moment and getting it from abroad, is that going to encourage China to diversify away from coal, which I think a lot of people would like to see in terms of the environment? Or is it actually going to just result in them producing more of their own?
Yeah, I think this is an important question, and I think it's a lot of it depends on the price of coal. I mean, at the moment, coal prices are near record highs, but there's shortages. So, and also they're near record highs because there are shortages.
Yes.
So the Chinese are very much forced to pay them. I think the way China views energy is quite pragmatic. I think when they focus on renewables, it's because they know that because China is so big that they can apply scale, which means that things like wind and solar energy, they can do so much of it that they can actually do it in an affordable and sustainable way, which is good news for everyone. The problem is that we saw a couple of years ago that would say solar energy, they produced too much and there was no way of distributing it. So I think longer term, the energy situation in China is going to be very interesting to see how they can, I mean, there is a focus on renewables as long as they're cheaper and as long as they make sense to do it. But they need to focus on the infrastructure to get the energy onto a grid. All of this sort of stuff is still in development. So I think as long as all that's going on, even though there will be international promises to reduce coal use, I think coal is still going to be a factor. And at the moment, as I say, it is short term, there's going to be a spike in coal use. I think longer term, they will slowly move out of coal. It's also causing a lot of pollution. And this is another of these factors that is causing unhappiness among the general population. It's funny, you know, one thing when this pandemic started, we had all our masks at home because in Beijing, you regularly had to wear a mask going out because the pollution was so bad. So we were just able to repurpose those for, you know, from one grim use to another grim use. But it's, you know, so that pollution is a big political factor. And given that coal is driving a lot of that, there will be an effort to move away from coal. And they've moved some of the coal-fired power stations, say, outside of the main cities. But again, then you've got a problem about how do you get the energy back to where it needs to go, and you know all these kind of issues. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on China to move out of coal, not just from the rest of the world, but also domestically, and which is ultimately good news.
So many of the questions we've had about Evergrande, but also about energy, are about what impact it has for other countries. And a China short on coal, short on natural gas, what impact does that have for everyone else around the world?
Well, yeah, this is the geopolitical aspect of this is very important. If you look at the South China Sea and China trying to expand its interests in the South China Sea, a lot of that is to get at energy resources there, and that's why the countries are you know, that's why it has problems with pretty much all its neighbours in the South China Sea, Philippines, Vietnam, etc. You know, everyone, they don't want to give up these areas because there are resources there, and so I think that's one aspect. And also we've seen with hydroelectric power in Burma, for example, the Chinese have been expanding into Burma to building power plants there. They've been changing the course of rivers. I mean, you know, suddenly we've seen this in many countries around the world, but you know, suddenly you're seeing, you know, the Irrawaddy is being moved, and to make power for China, and these sort of geopolitical concerns are very worrying. So it definitely will have a lot of fallout for the neighbours, and then globally. Then I mean, these things, you know, they tend to spread. You know, I mean, then it'll become an issue with India, and there's already issues with India, and then because as Europe becomes reliant on China for economically, the spillover there, as we've mentioned several times, you know, is going to be quite intense.
But of course, it's not just the shortages themselves, but the measures that China is taking to redress the energy crunch, which includes, you know, shutdowns at factories. That is something that we will notice as we presumably rely more and more on products from China.
Yeah, they're saying that there could be shortage of things like iPhones at Christmas, and this sort of
Heaven forbid.
I know, and but those kind of consumer goods are all made in China by factories that are only operating, which used to operate 18 to or 24 hours a day, suddenly only operating at 6 or 8 hours a day, and so suddenly you're going to see shortages, and you're going to see. And that's, if we can't get our Chinese goods,
Yeah, I mean, that's it, right? We've been talking in quite sort of ethereal terms with Evergrande about, effects on European investors and such. But actually, people around the world are going to feel tangibly what's happening in China at the moment and changes in the Chinese economy. We will notice them.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't seen them yet, and but I think just looking at what they've been saying, what Apple has been saying, what these companies have been saying, I think we could definitely see that.
That's interesting. Thank you for all your questions. Got one from Mantai Chan saying China's government stated that they can control the Evergrande default effect on their GDP, and now the energy crisis is worsening. So do you think they can still meet the GDP expectations this quarter, bringing together everything we've talked about so far?
Yeah, I mean, Chinese economic growth is slowing, and this quarter, in the last quarter, it was it slowed considerably, and by more than people were expecting. The statement that they can manage Evergrande was a funny one, because it was basically a political statement, much more than a statement, a policy statement. I think it was just saying, don't worry. And again, even if it's 2% of GDP, the Chinese government does have vast resources, but they weren't clear about how they were intending to do it. And then when you see lower growth figures, you sort of wonder, well, where are the weapons going to come from to deal with these challenges? It's always not going to be one thing that causes an economic. A major economic slowdown. It's going to be a combination of things, and in this case, you've got an energy crisis, and you've got a pandemic, and then you've got the real estate crisis, and they're all obviously linked. But you have got that coinciding of multiple factors that it would take, the sort of perfect storm that we talk about so much in the news business. How will Chinese people be feeling about their economy at the moment, and how will they be feeling towards their government? It's difficult to say. I mean, I think the way this is played in China is that there's very little reporting about what's going on in Evergrande. I think the other day there was reports that everything was fine, that they had made this particular payment. But I think generally it's very difficult for us to read about whether people are feeling dissatisfied, or whether they're if they are indeed believing all this stuff, because there's an awful lot of this patriotism at the moment that's being wheeled out, and patriotic war movies, and focusing on the history, looking backwards, which is a way of kind of deflecting attention away perhaps from the impact of a slowing economy. But Chinese will have noticed that they're being told not to heat their homes, and they will be feeling the impact, won't they? They will be noticing that things aren't perhaps as they should be at the moment. Definitely. I mean, I think that's, I think people are prepared to, people everywhere are prepared to take a short-term hit, because everyone knows that the pandemic has led to growth problems. Maybe that's the narrative there, is that it's something that's happening overseas that's causing it. Maybe the Americans are being blamed for it right now, given the sort of tensions between the US and China. But yeah, I think they'll be feeling they'll be feeling uncomfortable, particularly going into the winter. It's a question of how long this lasts, because that's the other big unknown, isn't it? How long is this energy crunch going to last? Because if it is a COVID related thing, and technically we are supposed to be at least coming out of COVID, then you would imagine that it is going to be something that should be relatively easily resolved. But then some people are saying it could be 2 years. So, what's the situation in China with COVID at the moment? Well, there are some outbreaks now, and they've had a handful of cases in various places. But then the whole, like in the city of Lanzhou we had yesterday, the whole city was shut down over a handful of cases. Immediately, everyone has to get tested. They've got very, very efficient approach to dealing with things, but at the same time, it's the zero COVID policy, which means that nothing happens, and that's problematic. Whereas other countries have basically it's had a much worse effect. But it also means the economies have been easier to, you can get stuff in and out.
Yeah, and that is the thing, right, is being able to get stuff in and out of China. Can we reach a point soon where that becomes less possible? I mean, basically, I'm asking, are things getting worse?
Yeah, I think up until about a week ago, things were looking better, and now things are looking worse again. Because even though it's a small number of cases, it's in more different places and geographically diverse places, and it's also domestic cases. Previously, it was always foreign cases that caused it. I mean, it must be having. I mean, nobody can really get into China now. It's very, very difficult to go there to do business. So, in terms of how that works on the ground for companies that have businesses there, it must be extremely difficult. And then, like I said, Xi Jinping hasn't left in over 600 days. So China, I think, finds it very easy to look inward. I mean, the whole economy was totally inward-looking until the late 80s. And before that, it was all domestic. There was very, very small overseas impact at all. So it's only in that interim period that it has become more and more international in terms of trade. But it seems to be that its default setting is to look inwards again.
We're running a little low on time. We haven't got long left, just a couple of minutes. So I want you to look into your crystal ball for me again. We've talked about Evergrande. We've talked about the property problems resulting from that. We've talked about the targeting of tycoons, and we've talked about the energy crunch. Are there any more fronts that are going to open up for China that you can foresee?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be more in the tech sector. I think that he's really Xi Jinping is really focusing on the tech sector as a way out of things. But I think the problem there is going to be that the tech sector seems to be a sector that does best in democracies somehow. I don't know. That sounds a little bit vague or Pollyanna-ish. I'm sorry, but it's just in terms of, because so much of it is about generating ideas and. It needs oxygen. The brain needs oxygen.
You also need a lot of people to get on board with something, right?
Exactly. Now, I'm not saying that China hasn't been fantastically successful at tech, but it's still the government recognises that it needs more innovation. It needs more of this, and I think at a time where you're also clamping down and becoming much more Marxist-Leninist in the way you view the economy and. That isn't going to encourage innovation. So I think the tech sector could be in for some challenges because they're also combined with the other challenges because of tariffs on or indeed export bans on components like chips. So it's going to really struggle and very resourceful country, but which will build these chip plants very quickly. But can they build them quick enough? So I think that's what we're looking forward now, or looking ahead, I think, to a tech sector difficulties.
OK, that's Clifford's hot tip. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this DW Business live stream on the looming crisis in China's economy with me, Rob Watts, and DW's resident China expert, Clifford Coonan. Clifford, if people want to get a bit more from you, where can they go to for that?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Clifford Coonan, and of course then on DW Business then.
Of course, We've regularly got Clifford coming on to give us more of his expertise. Thank you so much if you have submitted a question and a comment. And feel free to still submit your comments. We will go through and read them all after we're done here. Sorry if we didn't get round to yours and I didn't get to read it out, but we do appreciate all of them. Now, if you've enjoyed this, do hit the like and subscribe buttons. Let our bosses know that you've enjoyed it too. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.